In this session, we're going to take a look at frames and grids. What are frames and grids? Well, let me put a couple of them on our workspace. I'm going to go to Elements, and I'll scroll down to Frames. You'll see that there's a section for frames, and there's also a section for grids. When I place a grid on my workspace, it will take up my entire workspace. As opposed to when I place a frame on my workspace, it'll just be one element on my workspace, but I can arrange other elements around my workspace, around that frame. Now, if you go back to the grid does have corners that allow us to resize the grid. So in actuality, we can make the grid smaller or larger as needed. But by default, when we select the grid, it takes up all of the workspace. Also, the majority of the time, grids are made up of multiple frames. If we go into See All, we'll notice that the grids have multiple frames, which make up a grid. Now, what do you do with grids and what do you do with frames? Now that I've explained the difference between grids and frames, we use frames to place images, graphics, or backgrounds inside of them. They kind of make images or graphics look neat and tidy. As opposed to a grid, in a grid, you can place multiple images or graphics in each frame of that grid to make up a design. However, there are some things you cannot place in a frame or a grid. For example, shapes will not go into a frame, as opposed to an image that will go into a frame just by sliding it in there. I'm going to delete that shape, and I'm going to delete that grid on top. And I'll close my panel on the left. Let's take a look at the options available for our grid. We know that my grid is selected because I have a purple line going all the way around it. Now that it's selected, I have the options on my toolbar that are available for me to use with this grid. I can set the color of my grid. I can set a border with my grid. I can make the corners rounded. I can reduce or increase the spacing in between the frames that are on my grid. I can make my grid transparent. Now, note that if I had a picture in there, it would also make it transparent. I can animate my grid or apply an animation. And the animations are pretty similar to what we have seen already and work the same way. We can go into Position and Layers. And one thing that you will note, along with all the other options, is that if you wanted to manually change the width and the height of this grid, you have the option to lock the aspect ratio. So if we key in here and change the measurement to 5, that will automatically scale the height to maintain the ratio of the element that I have selected. And this will work with any element where that locking mechanism is available. We also have the option to rotate the element that we have selected. And of course, that rotation is also available when we select the element by moving that double arrow below the element, or it might be on the side of the element. Now you'll notice, along with other elements like text and shapes, when you move a grid, you will see guides that help you place that grid in the center, horizontally, and also vertically. Let's take a look at frames. So let's go to the second page. Here is my frame, and on the floating toolbar, we can see that there is a color chooser, but this color chooser has a line going through it. That signifies that there's nothing in my frame, and that frame is transparent. I can apply a color to this frame, or I can add or place an image inside my frame, just like the grid. However, I can't make my grid transparent. That is not an option. Now, when would you want to make your frame transparent? If you are layering frames one on top of another. You may have a frame that has an image in it where the background is transparent, and then you'll have a frame underneath that layer with a background or a color applied. And sometimes we will have frames layered one on top of another where we need to have one frame that is transparent. Next to the frame color, we'll notice that we also have the option for borders. And it's similar options. We can opt for a solid, dashed, or dotted, as well as the border weight. Now let's go back to grids for a moment, and let's select one of the frames in the grid. Previously, I had selected both grids. You can see the line all the way around. But when I select only one of the frames in that grid, I'm able to actually change the style of that frame individually without affecting the other frames in that grid. It's just a thought for you to remember. Let's go back to our frame and continue. Alongside, we also have the option to round corners. We have the option to make that frame transparent or opaque, which is slightly different than the color chooser. This goes straight to transparent. We have the option to animate. We have the option to go to position and layers, which is similar to the grid. You can also rotate here manually. You can lock the aspect ratio like we did the grid. We have the option to align on the page, and we also have the option to go to layers and move the layers one on top of another. But in this situation, again, I only have one element on my page, so there's nothing to move here. next to position layers, I have the copy style. And the copy style works similar to what we've seen before. I've copied the style of this frame, and I can apply it to this frame in this grid. And as we see, it has updated the border of this frame to have the same line and weight as the frame here. In addition to the copy style, we also see that there is a double arrow signifying that there could be more options available to use with this frame. And when I toggle that panel open, we get all the options available. And there isn't any more. That's basically all that's available, and we've already gone through all of these. Now, if I go back to my grid, it's pretty much the same. There are no additional options. Let's take a look at the floating menu. Looks pretty similar here. When we click on the More option and scroll down the list, there really aren't any additional options, except for download selection. Now, when we have multiple elements on our workspace and we want to download only that selection, we do have that option. Instead of going to Share and selecting page 1 or the element that we want to download, because that's what we're selecting. It's only this element or grid that we're downloading when we're selecting this option. So we can just go through and customize the download and then press download, and it will place that file, that finished file, in our folder on our computer. Now, if we go back to our frame and look at the floating menu, we don't have that option because this is only a single element on our workspace, as opposed to this grid that's comprised of 2 elements, which are grouped as a Canva grid. Now, when do you use a grid versus a frame? Well, if you wanted to use a grid as kind of a starting point as a template, because maybe you want to create a photo collage and you wanted a preset grid that you could just pop in images and colors and go from there, grids are a great starting point, as opposed to using a single frame that's part of a design where you can place images in to sort of clean up those images and make the edges a little bit more softer and contained. Now I'm going to go back up to my grid up here, and I'm going to select that grid and just delete it off my workspace. I'll go back to Elements and I'll scroll down to find another grid. So I'll just go into See All on the side, and I'll place this grid on my workspace. Now I'm going to go into Elements, and I'm going to search for a photo to place in this grid. So I'll search for a family, and I'll place this photo on my workspace. I'm going to drag this photo into the top frame of my grid. Now, if I want to reposition this image, I can just double click on that image and reposition it up and down, because there is a photo available on the bottom, and when I move it, there's photo available on the top. So I can have that option of moving it up and down. But there's no image on the right or on the left. And the image has to be as large as the frame. So the image needs to take up all of the frame. So I can't reposition it from left or right. I can, however, resize the image and make it larger and then move it from left to right. To set that image in place, I can just click outside and that will set it in place. I'm going to go back to my side panel and place another image on my workspace. I'll take this image and I'll put it on top of that other image, replacing it. Because that's what happens. That other image of the family is gone. In order to bring that back, we would have to press the undo button. Now, if you wanted to remove this image from this frame, we can press the delete key, or we can right-click and say detach image, and that will detach the image. I'm going to place the image back in this frame. And I want to show you a different way to delete an image. So not only can we click on that frame and press the delete button on the floating menu, we can also click in that frame and press the delete button. And that will also delete it from that frame that's part of a grid. I'm going to go back and place that image of the family back in my frame. But before I do that, I'm going to show you a little trick. When you're handling images, handle them by the side so that they don't accidentally fall into frames. As I move this image around, you'll notice that it's not falling into the frame because my cursor doesn't overlap that frame. As soon as my cursor overlaps the frame, that image will drop right into the frame. So that's just a little tip. Now, there are some things that will not go into frames. We can, though, shade frames. So I'll come up here to the color chooser, and you'll notice now that Canva has picked out some colors from that image. So I'll select that gray for my top frame. Now, as I mentioned, there are some things that cannot be placed in frames. Text is one of those things. So I've placed this text box on my grid, and I'm going to rename it. Now, this will not fall into my frame. It will stay on top of my frame. There are some graphic elements that will go into the frame and some that will not. For example, this image or graphic will not fall into that frame. If I search for pastel background, I will get these types of graphics. And if I select this graphic right here, I can drop it into that frame. So that is a type of graphic that I can place in a frame. My point, some graphics will go into frames and some graphics cannot go into frames. So you're not doing anything wrong when you cannot get a graphic in a frame. It's just the way that graphic was designed. It wasn't designed to go into a frame. Now the same applies to single frame elements. We can place images inside of frames. We can reposition them. We can resize them. We can double click and move them around. Now, when we place an image inside a frame, our toolbar will change to accommodate making changes to that image. So you'll see more options that will apply not only to the frame, but also to the photo. Now, like other elements, frames and grids will have that floating toolbar. In order to access it, you have to actually click on the grid. And when that purple outline is showing, you know that you have selected that grid. There are similar options here as we've seen with other elements on the floating toolbar. And when we click the More button, we see the options that are available for grids. And they're pretty much the same as we've already seen. Now, if I go to the frame on the second page and I select the More button, and as we move down, we will see Detach Image. We'll see Apply Colors to Page and Info. Now let's go back and talk about Detach Image. Like we saw previously with the grid, we can use Detach Image to remove this image from the frame. But let's see what happens when I select that image and I press the garbage can. We now get a prompt that asks us, do you want to delete the image or do you want to delete the frame? So what that means is Canva is asking you, do you want to only delete the image but leave the frame? Or do you want to delete the image and the frame? So just note that for future, that when you do want to just remove the image, you can also go to the garbage can and just say delete the image. Or if you want to delete both, you can also garbage can both. Let's go back to the floating menu and see what Apply Colors to Page is all about. Now, Apply Colors to Page takes the colors from this photo and it will apply them to the page. Let's see how that works. And again, we can shuffle again, and we can shuffle again. So that's what Apply Colors to Page does. The Info button gives us more information about that image. So again, in the floating menu, in the More section, we have options that not only apply to the frame, but also apply to the image. Now, the information about this image, it tells us who this image was created by, whether it's a Canva Pro or a Canva free image. It will tell us, it will give us a little bit of a description of the image. It'll show the keywords that are related to the image. You have the option to favorite the image. You can add that image to a folder. And there isn't an option to see more like that or view the collection at this stage in this option. But we don't have the option to see more like this or to view the collection. That's likely not available. The creator doesn't have a collection. Like grids, you can also resize frames by the corner and by the handles on the side. But note that as you resize, you may make the image inside the frame or the element inside the frame larger, or you may even crop it. So be careful when you are resizing frames and be mindful of what is happening with the image. You'll also want to note that you cannot resize all frames. Some frames do not have handles on the side that you can crop. Some frames you can only resize. So not all frames are made equal. Let's take a look at one more way that we can use a grid. Let's create another page. And let's go back to Elements and search for a grid that has 6 panels. We'll scroll down. And we'll choose this one. Let's go back to Elements and let's find 3 pictures of family. And I'll place this one on my workspace. I'll place this one, and I'll place this one. And I'll place this one up here, and I'll place this one below here. Now let's fill these quadrants with colors. So I'll pick the color chooser and I'll just choose colors that coordinate well with the images. And when I'm done, I'll just click outside. And so this is another very quick way that we can use a grid versus frames. Grids are like preset styles or templates that you can quickly use to create a photo collage or a flyer or anything else. In the next session, we're going to learn all about images and how to edit images, how to apply filters, and how to do some very creative things with photos and images.